In 1980, the South Bank Show filmed the writer William Golding in Marlborough, the town where he grew up, before talking about some of his most famous works, Lord of the Flies and The Spire. Is this as it was when you were a boy? Much the same sort of houses?
The houses are the same. They're painted. They've got different people in them. Far more cars, obviously. Far more noise. Everything more prosperous, prettier. The sweet shop is now a bijou home, you see.
And you used to go and sleep in that room?
Well, when I was a very small boy, I slept in there, and I was sent to bed early in the evenings, the way nice children were in those days. But the nasty children, who were the ruffian sort and had their shirts sticking out of their trousers and that, they used to play around here on the green, and I used to hang out of that window under an iron bar, watching them and wishing I were one of these ragged children. I fell desperately in love with a little girl because she wore white gloves, I remember.
How old were you then, about?
I can't remember. Minimal.
4 or 5?
That sort of time. Yeah.
Did you ever feel like escaping and joining the ruffians, or did you know your place?
I knew my place. I'm not really adventurous socially. I knew I was one of us and they were one of them, and the terrible thing was that us didn't really extend any further than the house, so really we had no place.
He wasn't exactly a recluse at that time, the end of the 70s, but he didn't like appearing on television, or as far as I know, radio. But anyway, he didn't like appearing on television. But he agreed that I could go down and have lunch with him and his wife Anne, which I did, outside Salisbury. Lovely thatched cottage, lovely garden. His wife was terrific. She was a scientist, very clever, very bright, very warm-hearted. And we had this lunch, the three of us, and we drank too much. Bill and I drank too much. And I got a letter from him a few days later saying, the ancient Assyrians had a code. You discussed serious matters twice, once when drunk and once again when sober. I'm coming to London in a couple of weeks and we'll be sober at tea time in the Dorchester. So we met at tea time in the Dorchester, had a sober cup of tea and agreed to do the film. William Golding's father was a rationalist and a socialist. He taught science at the local grammar school. His mother, also a socialist, was a suffragette. The house where they lived and its garden were overlooked, even dominated, by the town church. Did you go to this church?
No, never.
Did you go to another church? Or?
No, never. It looms over the house like a ship, like the bows of a ship sticking up like that. It is a kind of presiding gloom of the place almost.
Although strongly influenced by his father's socialism and rationalism, Golding's sense of mystery was never dispelled. In adolescence, he became aware of a conflict between his parents' scientific explanation of the world and his own feeling that there are some things science can't explain. Did your parents know you were writing when you were adolescent? Did they encourage you? Did they listen to you or set you in the right?
No, I was very shy about all this. I thought it was rather indecent in some curious way. I don't know why, but I had the feeling that to write poetry was a bit indecent. And so I concealed the fact that I was rhyming, you know.
The war came and you went in the war into the Navy. You said that the Second World War changed your attitude towards human beings and towards human nature. Can you tell us how it changed it?
It simply changed because bit by bit we discovered what the Nazis had been doing. And one saw that one's previous semi-pious belief that all you had to do was alter the social system and people would behave, in my terms, all you had to do was bring in socialism, as it were, and everybody would behave nicely because they had no reason not to. One saw that human beings weren't like that at all, that here was this highly civilized race of people who were doing, one gradually found out, things, impossible things. Bit by bit, as I discovered more and more what had gone on, I began to see that really it did go beyond any question of which country one was in. There was, I would call it, an almost absolute evil operating in there that I don't think there was operating anywhere else at all. And that really changed my view of what people were capable of, and therefore what human nature was.
After all, when you were teaching in Salisbury and you were married and you were writing, you wrote 3 novels, all of which were rejected by a great number of publishers. What kept you going?
I just went on. And after my 3 abortive novels, I don't suppose abortive is really the right word, because they were in fact completed. They weren't published, to put it that way. Then I said to myself, well, it looks as though what I have to do is write something that is individual to me. I have to write my own book, because nobody is going to pay any attention at all. And of course the book I wrote was Lord of the Flies, which was
one of the most successful books of the last 50 years, if I can finish that sentence, which you'd be too modest to finish. But before I come to Lord of the Flies...
No, you took the words right out of my mouth.
At the end. Lord of the Flies was published in 1954 and tells the story of a group of British schoolboys stranded on an island after a plane crash. They begin as model pupils, but swiftly descend into a condition of total savagery.
Halt! Where's the man with the trumpet? There's no man with a trumpet. Only me. Isn't there a man here? No. Then we'll have to look after ourselves.
How did that come about?
Well, I can give you the facts, insofar as there are any. We were living in a council flat at the time in a converted Victorian house, my wife and I, and we just put the children to bed, and pretty exhausting it had proved to be. And I'd been reading, well, we'd both been reading to them offhand, Cannibal Island, Treasure Island, Coral Island, Anybody's Island, Pirate Island, Islands Incorporated, really, which is what children's literature seemed to be at that time. And in this state of complete exhaustion, we were sitting one either side of the fire, my wife sitting one side and I the other. And I said to her, wouldn't it be a good idea to write a book about what actually would happen to children if they found themselves alone on an island? And my wife said, that's a first-class idea, you write it.
How can you describe what you felt about that then? Victorian children's island literature was great fun and perfect worlds and sporting chaps and gallant English boys.
I loved every minute of it when I was a boy. And I suppose it was unfair of me, but I took advantage of that situation to, as it were, ally myself with the innocence of that world before the war, and then send that innocence through the experience of the Second World War and what I think I'd found out about what people are capable of.
People can look at that story, Lord of the Flies particularly, and it's also true of The Inheritors, and it can be moved to any epoch of civilization you care to choose, because it's about, actually both books, The Inheritors and Lord of the Flies, are about groups of people and how groups of people interact, and for good or evil. If you look at something like what happened in Northern Ireland, or what happens in Rwanda, or what happens in any horrific, well, look at what's happening in Ukraine, at the moment. Groups of people suddenly decide that the very people they probably saw in the supermarket this morning were very amiable towards, they suddenly decide they're wrong or they're bad. They don't want them, just like the boys do in Lord of the Flies. He's onto something there, which I don't think any other writer has anatomized quite so shrewdly or painfully, that societies can go very badly wrong very, very quickly. And Golding seems to me to be one of the writers who's looked at the roots of the way societies prosper or fail in an extremely penetrating way, and that's eternal.
I think the first thing I saw that first time when my wife and I were sitting either side of the fire, the first thing I saw in my mind's eye was this goodwill, democratic, liberal leader being hunted by the others who'd reverted to what possibly one can say men are, you see. And so that stood first, in a sense, and then the rest simply followed, page after page. I saw it like a film in my mind's eye. And so then I just had to retell this story I'd already seen.
In 1980, I spoke to the author William Golding at his home in Wiltshire about his most famous novel, Lord of the Flies. It is a fable. Were you clearly and consciously aware of its fabulistic side when you were writing it?
I was aware of its didactic side. I would have agreed with the word fable once upon a time. I think my view of things has become a good deal, well, either complicated or, if you like, a little deeper. I don't know which it is. I think in many places that story breaks through being a fable and lays its finger on something which everybody recognizes, perhaps in themselves or in other people, and so it has a kind of power that a fable doesn't have.
Let me speak! I've got the conch!
In Lord of the Flies, the character of Piggy is the voice of reason. He petitions the others to uphold civilized values, but to no avail.
Which is it better to be? A pack of painted savages like you are? Or sensible like Ralphie?
I think more than almost any other work of post-war fiction, it deals with the problem of evil, what he calls at the end of the book, the darkness of man's heart. I find it very hard to even talk about without feeling quite emotional about it, because it's such a potent image. This little kid, Piggy, who doesn't have morality, he has no culture, but he knows what's right. He knows what's right. And of course, Bill was quite a hard man in some ways. I remember him saying to me when we were working on the book, things have been done on this island that ain't right, and it's not right what's been done. He said, he just laughed. He said, how pathetic almost Piggy is to try and adopt this moral code in a world which does not allow for that to be the case.
Lord of the Flies was, as I remember, almost instantaneous and a tremendous success critically and commercially. Did that commercial success enable you to quit school teaching?
Yes, it did. And I'm still astonished at the situation. I really am astonished at it. I never thought it would happen to me. I always thought I would be a writer, but I never thought I'd make money at it. In fact, to hark back to my father, he impressed on me. I think almost one of the last things I remember about him is his impressing on me that no member of our family would ever make any money except by hard and honest work. I've made it by light, delightful, and maybe dishonest work. I don't know.
William Golding went back to the Middle Ages for his novel The Spire. With Salisbury Cathedral as its inspiration, the novel is the story of how Jocelyn, a 14th century dean, is compelled by a vision to cap his cathedral with a spire, despite the apparent impossibility of building such a massive structure.
In a flash of vision, he saw how other feet would cut their track arrow straight towards the city, understood how the tower was laying a hand on the whole landscape, altering it, dominating it, enforcing a pattern that reached wherever the tower could be seen by sheer force of its being there. The countryside was shrugging itself obediently into a new shape. Presently, with its great finger sticking up, the city would lie like the hub at the center of a predestined wheel. New street, new inn, new wharf, new bridge, and now new roads to bring in new people.
Were you expressing there some sense of religious vision, some idea of yours about the power of religion?
I wanted to conceive the kind of man who would say this must be done and would not know at the beginning that even if God had told him to do this, nevertheless the cost was going to be his life and probably other people's lives too. I still think it's a good image almost of any human endeavor, that it can never be wholly good. It must always have a cost in people. That's what it was about.
Another fascination for Golding has been the sea. He was born next to the sea in Cornwall. He learned to sail on it as a boy and served in the Royal Navy during the war. The schoolboys in Lord of the Flies are cut off from civilization by the sea. It surrounds Pincher Martin, the central character of Golding's third novel, Washed Overboard in the North Atlantic. And his most recent novel, Rites of Passage, is set aboard a ship sailing between England and Australia.
Now the sea would suck down, making cascades and waterfalls of retreating water, would sink past the rocks and plaster down the seaweed like shining hair, then pausing, gather and rise with a roar, irresistibly swelling over point and outcrop, climbing the little cliff, sending at last an arm of surf up a gully to end a yard or so from him in fingers of spray.
I find it very difficult to talk here now because I'm watching the sea all the time. The sea always makes me watch it all the time. I've spent hours and hours, not just on the sea, but just watching wave after wave come in. If it's an image of anything, I think it's an image of our unconscious, the unconscious of our own minds. Or you could say, I suppose you could put it the other way around, and that is that we have a sea in us. After all, we are sea creatures that learnt to walk on the land, are we not? And perhaps one way and another we go back to it. Every night when we dream, we go back into that kind of depth, and that kind of beauty and monstrosity and mystery.
He was dazzled by the massivity of the sea and also mesmerized by its power. He'd been in a very, very near, he and Anne, who did a lot of sailing, had been on the wrong side of a huge crash with a big boat in the channel, and they just got away with it. And he realized that he would become frightened of the sea. So that was interesting, the way he was just carried away by that and the power of the sea.
I had a quite large yacht, and I and my wife and my daughter and 3 friends were on it, and we were run down in thick fog in the channel and sunk, and we all got away with our lives, though nothing else. And I thought to myself then, I'm never going to be responsible for anybody else's life at sea again. So I just stopped, I guess. Now I feel it's out there and it can't get at me. And yet, in a sense, when I look at it, it seems to render any conversation a kind of irrelevance. So it's been here, it'll go on being here. Oh yes, it's there all right.
Perhaps I ought to make a statement here, and that is this, that I'm treated as a philosopher, as a theologian, as a historian, as a psychologist, if not a psychiatrist. But in fact, what I am at bottom is a storyteller. Now, what I'm really interested in is in what gives power to a story. Well, story is so deeply bitten into the human psyche that if you take a child and sit him on your knee, if he's howling, and you say, once upon a time, you've got him. And you've got anybody if you can say once upon a time to them convincingly enough. And this is what it means to be a storyteller.
I think actually the books are very far from being modest in their ambition or in their achievement. After all, he's talking about the most fundamental things that happen to people. You know, he's talking about why society does or doesn't work, whether mankind is innately good or innately evil, whether sexuality is simply a violent, uncontrollable impulse that tears through all conventions and apparent morality to get what it wants. He's talking about amazingly fundamental things, and yet his public statement about them is very English. Well, it's not really, you know. So it's interesting that the Nobel Committee spotted, you know, that eternal quality in his work, and also interesting that at his Nobel speech he remained determinedly English and sort of modestly, you know, humble and not at all grand.
And what do you think, finally, stories, and stories such as yours, are doing for Homo sapiens at the moment?
Oh dear, I think it would be talking big to say it's possible to make people more aware of their nature through stories. But that might be so. Equally, it might be no more than pour passer le temps, just to entertain people while they're waiting.
Thank you very much.